My father stared me straight in the eye and said, "If you won't hand over your house to your brother, we'll find another way." Without missing a beat, I replied, "That will be the last foolish thing you ever do for your useless son." Growing up, my brother Isaac, 31M, was always the undisputed favorite child. And I'm not talking about a little extra attention here and there. I mean complete, over-the-top favoritism where he could do absolutely no wrong in my parents' eyes. It was honestly unbelievable. My mom, 56F, and dad, 59M, constantly went out of their way to make life easier for him, while I had to earn every single thing I got. When Isaac failed out of college, nobody made a big deal about it. My parents simply paid for him to attend another school. When he wrecked his car because of his own reckless driving, they replaced it almost immediately with a brand new one. Meanwhile, I had to maintain straight A's just to receive a lukewarm good job from them. If I ever brought home a B+, they acted as though I had committed some serious offense. The favoritism was so obvious that even relatives would occasionally point it out during family gatherings. Of course, instead of acknowledging it, my parents would become defensive and somehow find a way to blame me for creating tension. That was their usual strategy. After graduating from college, which I paid for myself through scholarships, grants, and student loans, by the way, Isaac married Nora, 30F, his longtime high school sweetheart. In many ways, she's exactly like him. She expects things to be handed to her and becomes upset whenever life doesn't go according to her plans. Honestly, they make a perfect pair. Today, they have 2 children together. I love my niece and nephew. They're great kids, but they quickly became another excuse for my parents to continue pouring money and support into Isaac's life. Whenever I questioned the unequal treatment, the answer was always the same. They need help. They have children. That became the standard excuse. The height of their entitlement came when they purchased a huge house in one of those identical suburban developments. It was far larger than they needed, significantly more expensive than they could comfortably afford, and way beyond their actual financial capabilities. In reality, they were only a paycheck or 2 away from serious financial trouble. But appearances meant everything to Isaac and Nora. Looking successful mattered more to them than being financially responsible. At the same time, I was living in a tiny apartment with 2 roommates, saving every dollar I could. I worked a demanding finance job that paid reasonably well, but required 60 or more hours every week. Most days I would come home completely exhausted, eat a cheap bowl of ramen, and fall asleep almost immediately before repeating the exact same routine the next morning. For 3 straight years, I lived like a monk. I rarely went out with friends. I hardly dated. I continued driving the same old Toyota I'd owned since college. I denied myself almost every unnecessary expense. My coworkers thought I was strange because I brought the exact same peanut butter sandwich to work every day instead of ordering lunch like everyone else. But there was a reason for all of it. I had a goal. I want to buy my own house. Not rent one. Not lease one. Own one. And not just any property, but a decent home in a neighborhood where I wouldn't constantly worry about crime or vandalism. When I finally reached my savings target after those 3 difficult years, I began seriously searching for a home. Eventually, I found a modest 3-bedroom house with a decent-sized backyard in a respectable neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't flashy. It was simply a well-built home in a quiet area with good schools nearby. I didn't even have children, but strong school districts generally help property values. The previous owners had taken excellent care of the house, and it only needed a few cosmetic updates. Throughout the entire home buying process, my parents never offered any assistance. Not financially, not emotionally, nothing. They didn't offer a single dollar. They didn't offer to co-sign. They didn't even accompany me to view potential homes when I asked. My father simply shrugged and said, "Houses are money pits," before turning his attention back to the television. When I finally closed on the property 3 years ago, I felt incredibly proud of myself. I had accomplished something major completely on my own. To celebrate, I invited my family over for a small housewarming gathering, hoping they might finally acknowledge my achievement. Instead, my father walked inside, immediately noticed a small crack in the drywall near the entrance, and asked whether I had inspected the foundation. My mother didn't even congratulate me before asking when the guest room would be ready for them to stay in. And Isaac looked around, smirked slightly, and described the place as cozy. The way he said it made it obvious he actually meant small. Still, I didn't let it bother me. The house belonged to me, and I loved it. I spent countless weekends improving it. I painted rooms. I learned how to replace a garbage disposal by watching online tutorials. Last summer, I even built a small deck in the backyard entirely by myself. Over time, the house became much more than a property. It became my project, my accomplishment, my sanctuary. Meanwhile, Isaac and Nora continued struggling financially while maintaining the illusion that everything was fine. They hosted expensive barbecues. They bought furniture they couldn't truly afford. They constantly spent money they didn't have. Whenever financial problems appeared, my parents rushed in to rescue them. They paid insurance bills. They covered unexpected expenses. They provided loans that everyone knew would never be repaid. Whenever I attended family dinners, conversations always revolved around Isaac's latest job opportunity, the children's activities, or whatever crisis he happened to be dealing with. Nobody asked about my promotion. Nobody cared about the kitchen renovation I had just completed. Nobody showed interest in anything happening in my life. It was the same family dynamic that had existed for decades. Nothing ever changed. So that's how things remained until a couple of months ago. I had my modest home that I worked incredibly hard to earn. Isaac continued living beyond his means, with my parents constantly supporting him. Then everything changed when Isaac lost his job. He had been working as a sales manager earning a respectable salary, and suddenly that income disappeared overnight. The problem was that his income had never really been enough to support the lifestyle he and Nora insisted on maintaining. According to Isaac, the company had gone through a restructuring process, and his entire department had been eliminated. According to a friend of mine who happened to work at the same company, the reality was a little different. Isaac had apparently been skating on thin ice for months because he consistently missed performance targets and regularly showed up late. Whatever the actual reason, the result was the same. Suddenly, Isaac couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments on that oversized house. They missed one payment. Then they missed another. My parents stepped in and helped for a while. But eventually, even they couldn't keep carrying the weight of Isaac's enormous mortgage on top of all his other expenses. After 3 missed payments, foreclosure was becoming a very real possibility. Isaac and Nora were panicking, but they still refused to consider downsizing, selling the house, or making any practical decisions before the situation became even worse. Instead, they continued waiting for some kind of miracle to rescue them from the consequences of their own choices. And that's when my parents came up with their brilliant plan. That's the moment things stopped being ordinary family dysfunction and crossed straight into complete insanity. About 2 months ago, my parents called and invited me over for dinner on a Tuesday evening. Family dinners happen every few weeks. Usually, it was because Mom felt she hadn't had the opportunity to criticize my life choices face-to-face recently enough. So I assumed it would be the usual routine. The moment I arrived, though, something felt strange. Mom had prepared my favorite meal. That only happened when she wanted something from me. Dad was acting unusually friendly. Instead of barely acknowledging me, he was actually asking questions about work and pretending to care about the answers. A little later, Isaac and Nora arrived. They looked exhausted and stressed, though they were clearly trying to hide it. We had barely started eating when Dad cleared his throat and dropped the bombshell. He casually announced that since Isaac had children and I didn't, I should give him my house because, in his words, it simply made sense. I literally stopped chewing. The food just sat in my mouth while I tried to process what I had just heard. My mom flashed that familiar smile. If you've ever dealt with a manipulative parent, you know exactly the smile I'm talking about. The one that appears right before they try to convince you that sacrificing your own happiness is somehow your responsibility. You can always buy another house, sweetheart, she said softly. You're young. You don't have a family depending on you. Think about the children. I stared at her. You want me to just hand over my house? Dad shrugged as if he were asking me to lend Isaac $5. Not hand it over exactly. We can work something out. But they need a stable place to live. Then he added, you're alone. It's the right thing to do. At that point, my brain felt like it was completely malfunctioning. I looked over at Isaac and Nora. Neither of them would meet my eyes. Both were staring down at their plates. That told me everything I needed to know. They had known about this plan all along. I turned back toward my parents, genuinely trying to understand how we had arrived at this moment. These were the people who raised me, and they were sitting across from me with completely straight faces asking me to give away the house I had sacrificed years of my life to buy. The house I earned through hard work, discipline, and countless hours of overtime. They wanted me to hand it over to my brother, a man who had never truly worked for anything he owned. I answered with a single word. No, that was it. Simple, direct, final. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It felt like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Mom's smile disappeared. Dad's face hardened. Across the table, Isaac and Nora exchanged a glance that was equal parts panic and anger. My mother slowly took a sip of water before calmly saying, "We'll take it another way." The moment those words left her mouth, a chill ran down my spine. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I asked. Dad waved his hand dismissively. Forget it, he said. Just think about it. Not long afterward, I left. The entire drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow been threatened by my own parents. As soon as I got home, I checked that all my important documents were locked safely inside my fireproof safe and not sitting anywhere accessible. At the time, it felt a little paranoid. Part of me thought I was overreacting. As it turned out, I wasn't being paranoid enough. I texted my friend Ian, who's always been my go-to person whenever family drama gets out of control. I gave him a summary of everything that had happened and asked whether I was losing my mind. His response came back almost immediately. "Dude, your family is insane. Change your locks." I laughed when I read it. At first, I assumed he was exaggerating. But the more I thought about Mom's strange comment, the less comfortable I felt. What exactly did she mean by "take it another way"? The phrase sounded vaguely threatening. Still, I convinced myself it was probably just another manipulation tactic. A week after that bizarre dinner, I dragged myself into work looking absolutely exhausted. I'd barely slept the night before. My coworker Ryan took one look at me, silently slid his coffee across my desk, and went back to work. A true friend move. I was trying to focus on a spreadsheet I'd been working on when my phone rang around 10 o'clock that morning. The caller ID showed my bank. That immediately caught my attention because they almost never called unless something important was happening. I answered. The woman on the line introduced herself as Melissa from the mortgage department. She politely asked whether she could verify some information regarding my mortgage refinance application. I immediately sat up straighter in my chair. My what? I asked. Melissa explained that their office had received a request earlier that morning to refinance my mortgage. Refinance application. I immediately sat up straighter in my chair. My what? I asked. Melissa explained that their office had received a request earlier that morning to refinance my mortgage. The application had been submitted under my name. However, several inconsistencies in the paperwork had triggered internal security alerts. I told her immediately that I had never submitted any refinance request. Not recently. Not ever. I was perfectly satisfied with my current mortgage. There was absolutely no reason for me to refinance. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. Well, someone did. For a moment, I felt sick. I immediately instructed her to place a hold on everything. Don't process anything, I said. Don't approve anything. Freeze it all. She assured me that the application would be suspended pending an investigation. The second the call ended, I informed my boss that I had a family emergency. Then I grabbed my keys and practically ran out of the office. I drove straight to the bank. When I arrived, I requested a meeting with someone in the mortgage department regarding a possible case of fraud. A loan officer pulled up the application paperwork on his computer and began reviewing the file in front of me. When a loan officer turned the monitor toward me, I honestly felt my stomach drop. There it was. A complete mortgage refinance application submitted under my name. Every piece of my personal information was included. My social security number, my date of birth, my employment information, my income details, everything. But the real shock came when I looked at the ownership section. The new mortgage wasn't just in my name. It listed my parents as co-owners. They had literally attempted to insert themselves onto my mortgage and gain control over my property. My hands started shaking as I stared at the screen. They had even forged my signature. The bank employee explained that whoever submitted the application had apparently used old documents containing my signature as templates. Immediately, I remembered all the paperwork I'd left at my parents' house years earlier after graduating from college. The loan officer pointed to several areas that had triggered the bank's fraud detection system. The signatures didn't perfectly match. The email address was incorrect. A few details didn't line up with information already on file. Those inconsistencies were the only reason the application had been flagged for verification. If the bank security system hadn't caught those errors and called me directly, my parents might have actually succeeded. They could have taken control of my mortgage and effectively stolen my house right out from under me. I was furious. Not angry. Not upset. Absolutely furious. I immediately requested printed copies of every fraudulent document. I also made sure the bank placed detailed notes in their system stating that I had never authorized any part of the application. While still sitting in the bank, I called my mother and put the phone on speaker so the loan officer could hear the conversation. The moment she answered, I got straight to the point. "You tried to steal my house." There was a brief pause. Then, unbelievably, she didn't even deny it. Instead, she said, "Oh, don't be so dramatic." I almost laughed from disbelief. Dramatic? You committed fraud. That's illegal. The kind of illegal that can send people to jail. She sighed as though I was the unreasonable one. "Oh, relax. We were only trying to help. If you'd agreed in the first place, none of this would have been necessary. I'm reporting this." The warmth immediately disappeared from her voice. "You wouldn't do that to your own family. Watch me." Then I hung up. I turned back to the loan officer. "Who do I need to speak with about pressing charges?" He directed me to the bank's fraud department. After explaining the situation, they told me I would need to file a police report and potentially retain an attorney. As I walked out of the bank, I called my friend Ian. I told him everything that had happened. His reaction immediately escalated from, "Your family's crazy," to "Holy crap, man. Get a lawyer right now." He recommended his cousin, an attorney named Derek. At that point, I was still struggling to process the fact that my own parents had attempted to commit fraud in order to take my house. During the drive home, my phone started exploding with calls and text messages. Dad called, then Mom, then Isaac, then Dad again, then Isaac. Eventually, I turned my phone completely off. I didn't have the energy to deal with any of them. The following day, I called in sick to work and scheduled a meeting with Derek. I brought every piece of evidence I had: the forged mortgage paperwork, the bank records, the notes from the fraud department, even a written statement from the loan officer who had flagged the application. Derek reviewed everything carefully. The more he read, the more concerned he looked. That evening, my phone started blowing up again. Mom, Dad, Isaac, over and over. I ignored every call until Dad rang for the third time. Finally, I answered. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded the second I picked up. "What am I doing?" I shot back. "You tried to steal my house." That's a strong word. It's the correct word. I paused before adding, fraud is another good word. Identity theft works too. Dad let out an irritated sigh. "Listen, this doesn't need to go any further. Drop all this legal nonsense, and we'll pretend it never happened." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You think I'm overreacting?" "Yes," he said immediately. "We're family. Family helps each other." I laughed bitterly. Family doesn't commit fraud. For a moment, there was silence. Then his voice changed. The friendly act disappeared completely. "If you take this to court," he said coldly, "don't expect us to stand beside you. You'll be cutting ties with this family permanently." I shook my head. "I think you already did that when you tried to steal from me." Then I ended the call. Part of me hoped that would finally be the end of it. I thought maybe they'd realize how badly they'd crossed the line. Maybe they'd back off. Maybe they'd even apologize. I should have known better. The next morning, I walked outside and immediately saw the damage. My house had been completely covered in eggs. Not just a few thrown at the front door. The front entrance, garage door, windows, and even my car were covered in dried yolk and broken shells. It looked like someone had spent considerable time making sure every visible surface got hit. I checked my security camera footage. Sure enough, there they were. Evan and Mara were laughing hysterically while throwing eggs. Standing nearby was my mother. She wasn't participating directly. She was simply watching, as if she approved of everything. I immediately contacted the police and filed a report. The responding officers were sympathetic, but explained there wasn't much they could do beyond pursuing vandalism charges. I figured that would be the end of the day's surprises. I was wrong. Less than 2 hours later, the power in my house suddenly shut off. At first, I assumed there was an outage. I checked the breakers. Nothing had tripped. When I stepped outside, I noticed the lock on my electrical panel had been cut. The main switch had been manually turned off. After calling the utility company, they confirmed that someone had tampered with the equipment. I didn't need them to tell me who was responsible. I already knew. By the following morning, the eggs had baked into the paint under the heat of the sun. They were nearly impossible to remove. I spent 2 frustrating hours trying to clean everything myself before finally giving up and hiring a mobile detailing service. That little adventure cost me $200. Afterward, I called Derek and updated him on everything. I sent him all of the security footage, every video, every photo, every report. After reviewing it, he advised me to immediately seek a restraining order. I drove straight to his office carrying all the evidence. Once he reviewed everything, he began preparing the paperwork without hesitation. That night, I stayed at Ian's house. I needed a break from constantly looking over my shoulder every time I stepped outside my own home. The next morning, after spending the night there, I drove back to my house. Given how quickly everything had escalated, part of me expected to find the place burned down or seriously damaged. Instead, I found something much stranger. A thick stack of papers had been shoved underneath my front door. It looked as though someone had pushed them through the mail slot during the night. At first, I assumed it was another threat from my parents. Maybe legal documents. Maybe some kind of warning. But when I started flipping through the pages, I realized it was something entirely different. The documents were medical records. More specifically, they were psychiatric evaluations from when I was a teenager. And somehow, someone had left them on my doorstep. When I was 16, I went through a rough period. I got caught with weed at school, my grade dropped, and I went through the usual teenage rebellion phase. Nothing extreme by normal standards. But to my parents, it was as if I was on a direct path toward prison. They forced me to see a psychiatrist who essentially signed off on whatever version of events my parents wanted. The documents showed diagnoses of oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. If you're familiar with psychiatric evaluations, those labels often boil down to difficult teenager who refuses authority. The report was full of exaggerated claims about my behavior, most of which I strongly believe came directly from my parents rather than any objective observation. Attached to the file was a handwritten note from my mother. Remember who you really are. Drop this nonsense or we'll show everyone, including your workplace. So now they weren't just controlling me. They were actively threatening to damage my reputation and potentially my career using outdated psychiatric record from when I was a minor. Perfect. Wonderful parenting. That evening, Derek called me. You need to come in again. This is important. My mind immediately started racing. I was already mentally drained from everything happening, but something in his tone told me this was serious. When I arrived, Derek was waiting with what felt like a bombshell. He slid a thick folder across the desk. We ran a background check on your parents, he said. Standard procedure in a case like this. I opened it, and my stomach dropped instantly. Inside was a criminal record. What is this? I asked, struggling to process what I was seeing. Derek explained that this wasn't new behavior for them. My father had been arrested in the 1990s for tax fraud. My mother had previously been caught using someone else's identity to open credit cards. I just stared at him, completely speechless. My entire life, I had seen my parents as strict, controlling, and deeply unfair. But nothing like this. This was something else entirely. It was years ago, Derek continued. They avoided serious penalties with fines and probation. But considering what they just attempted with your mortgage, it shows a clear pattern. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My parents weren't just strict or controlling. They had a documented history of fraud, and they were now attempting one of the biggest scams of their lives on their own son. I kept flipping through the pages. It wasn't just a single incident for each of them. My father had multiple tax-related issues, including a case where he falsely claimed business expenses for a company that didn't even exist. My mother had at least 3 separate identity theft cases, all involving people she knew socially. How had I never known any of this? Most of these cases were settled quietly, Derek said, and they all happened when you were very young. The most recent one was about 15 years ago. That detail hit me hard. 15 years ago would have placed it right around the time I was 17, when they were pressuring me heavily about where to apply for college. Suddenly, their insistence that I only apply to local schools made a lot more sense. They likely couldn't leave the state due to legal restrictions or probation terms. What does this mean for our case? I asked. It means we can prove this isn't an isolated mistake, Derek replied. It establishes a long-term pattern of fraudulent behavior. That significantly strengthens our position. He tapped the psychiatric evaluation documents I had brought earlier. And this, he added, is clear evidence of intimidation. We can include it in the charges. My entire childhood suddenly started replaying in my head, but now everything had a different meaning. Then Derek interrupted my thoughts. There's more. He opened another folder. We received responses to the subpoenas we issued for their financial records. He slid it toward me. Your parents are in serious debt. They've taken out multiple high-interest loans over the last few years. They've maxed out credit cards, refinanced their home multiple times, and even borrowed against life insurance policies. How much are we talking? I asked quietly. At least $300,000, he said. Possibly more. He paused before adding, some of these loans are from what we can politely call non-traditional lenders. Basically, he continued, financial criminals are often very good at maintaining appearances. This looks like part of a larger pattern. I leaned back in my chair, completely overwhelmed. My entire family history suddenly felt like it had been built on lies. The parents who constantly lectured me about responsibility and honesty were, in reality, deeply entangled in financial fraud themselves. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, Derek spoke again. There's one more thing you need to know. He looked at me seriously. We found irregularities suggesting they may have used your identity for more than just the recent mortgage attempt. My stomach tightened. That's when I found out there was a loan from 6 years ago in my name, but the listed address was my parents' house. It was possible they had been using my identity for years without me knowing. 6 years ago, I had just graduated college. I was living in a small, run-down apartment with roommates, working an entry-level job, barely making ends meet. I was broke but focused on building my life from nothing. Meanwhile, my parents may have been quietly taking out loans in my name. Can we confirm it? I asked. Derek nodded. I've already requested the full documentation from a bank. We should have it within a day or two. I felt physically ill. If they had been using my identity for years, there was no telling what else existed under my name. Credit cards, additional loans, tax debts, anything. Derek then laid out the next steps. The first move was to immediately freeze my credit to prevent any further accounts from being opened. Second, he told me to obtain a full credit report so we could identify any additional suspicious activity. Third, file a formal police report specifically focused on the identity theft claims. Fourth, proceed with the restraining order based on the ongoing harassment and escalating behavior. I followed every step. By the time evening came around, I was completely drained, mentally and emotionally, but at least I had started putting protections in place around myself and my finances. When I finally got home, I noticed Ian sitting in his car outside my house. He had been worried after not hearing from me all day and came over to check if I was okay. I invited him inside and gave him a condensed version of everything I had just learned. His reaction was exactly what I needed in that moment. No judgment, no panic, just a calm acknowledgement of how messed up the situation was. After that, he ordered pizza, and we spent the night watching movies until midnight, deliberately avoiding any discussion about my family. For a few hours, it almost felt normal again. Then, late that night, I received a text from my brother Isaac. We need to talk. Meet me at Denny's on Main. It's about mom and dad's situation. He added, It's serious. I read it over several times. Curiosity outweighed exhaustion, but I also had a bad feeling about it. Still, I went. What could possibly get worse? I remember thinking. Part 6. When I pulled into the Denny's parking lot, Isaac's Subaru was already there. The place was nearly empty, as expected for a Tuesday night around 10 p.m. Inside, Isaac was sitting alone in a corner booth, looking visibly worn down. He looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in days. "What is this about?" I asked as I sat down. "Because if you're here to convince me to drop the charges or hand over my house, you're wasting both of our time." "It's not that," he replied quickly. "Well, not exactly." Then he lowered his voice. "I didn't know they actually went through with it." "With what?" I asked, already tense. "With using your name for loans," he said. "They talked about it years ago. Something about leveraging all available resources or some nonsense like that." I thought it was just talk. My stomach tightened. "So you knew?" I asked sharply. "Not for sure," he defended himself. "They mentioned it once or twice. I told them it was a terrible idea." I stared at him for a moment, then reminded him that whether he personally approved or not, he still had no problem trying to take my house during all of this. That shut the conversation down for a moment. Then things shifted. Isaac suddenly looked nervous, genuinely nervous, as he started explaining just how deep the situation with our parents really went. According to him, the financial issues my lawyer had uncovered were only the surface layer of a much larger problem. Our parents reportedly owed more than $100,000 to loan sharks. One of those lenders had even allegedly made comments about knowing where Isaac's children went to school. At that point, the house scheme made more sense in a twisted way. It wasn't just greed or control. They were desperate. They needed assets. They needed leverage. They needed anything they could use to stay afloat and pay off dangerous people. It didn't excuse anything, but it helped explain why they were willing to go so far. Then Isaac dropped the real shock. Our parents had also taken out loans using his children's identities, his actual toddlers. They had used their social security numbers to open credit accounts and secure loans worth thousands of dollars. The children would likely only discover the damage years later, when they tried applying for student loans or credit cards. When I asked how he found out, Isaac explained that he had accidentally discovered a folder full of identity documents while searching for birth certificates the previous week. Inside were records for everyone. Mine, his, the kids, even some extended family members. I also asked about the vandalism and damage to my property. Isaac looked uncomfortable and admitted it had been a reckless plan pushed by our mother. He acknowledged he shouldn't have gone along with it, though he still tried to justify parts of it. When I suggested more rational options, selling the house, restructuring debt, or even filing bankruptcy, Isaac shook his head. He explained that the house already had 3 separate mortgages and was deeply underwater by at least $200,000. And even bankruptcy wouldn't solve the problem with the loan sharks. The entire situation was far worse than I had imagined. When I asked why he was telling me all of this now, Isaac finally got to the real reason. He wasn't there for our parents. He was there for his children. He needed help figuring out how to repair their credit histories and clear the fraudulent loans without Nora finding out. If she discovered the truth, he believed she would leave immediately and take the kids with her. Part of me wanted to refuse outright. He had made his choices. He had participated in this mess. But those kids were innocent. My niece and nephew hadn't asked for any of this. So I told them I would think about helping with the children's situation. However, I made it very clear that I was not dropping the charges against our parents, and I was not giving up my house. Isaac seemed to accept that boundary. Before I left, he warned me that our parents were planning something else. He didn't know the details, only that he had overheard our mother talking on the phone about a last option if everything else failed. That alone was enough to make my stomach turn. Great, just what I needed to hear. On the drive home, I called Derek immediately and relayed everything Isaac had told me. He told me to document the conversation while it was still fresh and to remain extremely cautious about security moving forward. That night, I made a decision. Regardless of everything that had happened, I would help my niece and nephew if I could. They didn't deserve to be trapped in this situation. But first, I had to deal with whatever my parents were preparing next. And whatever that was, it revealed itself the very next day, leading straight into the final confrontation that tore everything wide open. After that meeting with Isaac, I stayed on high alert. His warning that my parents were planning some kind of last option had me constantly on edge. The next day, I installed a Ring doorbell camera and added motion sensor lights around the entire property. It probably made my house look like it was being prepared for a full-blown invasion, but I'd rather look paranoid than be caught off guard again. For the following 2 days, I worked from home. Nothing happened. No strange cars. No messages. No attempts to contact me. The silence, strangely enough, felt almost more unsettling than the harassment itself. Then on the third day, I received an email from Derek. He had finally obtained the documentation tied to the loan that had been taken out in my name 6 years earlier. What he sent over was completely damning. My forged signature, my social security number, and the loan proceeds had been transferred directly into my parents' bank account. There was no attempt at hiding it, no effort at disguise. It was all blatantly connected. But what disturbed me most was seeing my mother listed as a co-signer. She had physically gone into a financial institution, presented herself as acting in my interest, and knowingly participated in fraud against me. Derek told me that this gave us more than enough evidence to proceed with formal charges for identity theft and financial fraud. He had already prepared all the necessary legal documentation and only needed my final approval to move forward with filing everything with law enforcement and the district attorney's office. At that moment, I was standing in a line I couldn't step back from. If I agreed, my parents would almost certainly be arrested and likely serve prison time. Even after everything they had done, the weight of that decision still hit hard. But then I thought about my niece and nephew. 2 innocent children whose financial identities were already being damaged before they even understood what credit was. Then I thought about the years of manipulation, the attempt to take my house, the fraud, and the constant harassment. "Do it," I replied. That evening, around 8 p.m. as the sky was beginning to darken, I heard a car pull into my driveway. I checked my security camera feed and immediately saw my parents' Lexus parked outside. My heart started racing. I sent Derek a quick message. "They're here. I'm recording everything." Then I turned on an audio recording app on my phone and slipped it into my pocket. I opened the front door. My mother was the first to speak. "You're really going to do this over a misunderstanding?" she snapped. "A misunderstanding?" I shot back. "You stole my identity." My father stepped forward, pointing directly at me. "Lower your voice. We are still your parents." "How could you do this?" "Parents don't steal from their children," I replied. "We gave you everything," my mother said sharply. "And this is how you repay us? By trying to put us in jail? Do you even understand how cruel you've become? You gave me nothing but anxiety and therapy bills," I said. My mother's face turned bright red. My father suddenly moved toward me aggressively. And at that exact moment, the doorbell rang. Police officers and a financial crimes detective, coordinated by Derek as a welfare check, were standing outside, scheduled to arrive precisely at 8:30 p.m. My mother immediately tried to shift into a calm, innocent demeanor, but the detective was clearly unconvinced by what he was hearing. My father attempted to escape through the back door. He didn't make it. Both of them were detained, handcuffed, and formally read their rights. As they were being escorted away, my mother made one final desperate attempt. "You wouldn't do this to your own mother. You did it to yourself," I said, and I watched them leave. After it was over, I sat down on the front steps, completely drained. It was finished, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt hollow. My phone buzzed. A message from Isaac. "Is it done?" "Yes," I replied. "They're in custody." About 10 minutes later, his car pulled up. He stepped out slowly, looking just as exhausted as I felt, and sat down beside me on the steps. "Are you okay?" I asked. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "No, not really." "Yeah," I said quietly. "Me neither." We sat there for a while in silence, watching the streetlights flicker on as darkness settled in. "What happens now?" he finally asked. "They'll be arraigned tomorrow," I said. He nodded slowly. "And the kids? Their credit? We'll have to file separate police reports specifically for identity theft involving them," I explained. Nora is probably going to find out. The case moved quickly after that. The evidence against them was overwhelming. They tried to defend themselves, of course. They blamed me. They blamed Isaac. They even blamed the bank for failing to prevent the fraud. None of it held up. Both of them were convicted. My mother received a 3-year sentence. My father received 5 years due to prior offenses and because he was considered the primary orchestrator. Isaac fought hard to clear his children's names from the fraudulent accounts. But with the legal findings against our parents, he eventually succeeded. My own name was also cleared from the older loan tied to my identity. Nora ultimately left Isaac, taking the children back to her parents' home in Connecticut. I can't really blame her. She has agreed to allow supervised visitation, which is more than I expected. As for me, I kept the house. I installed a full security system and adopted a German shepherd named Rex, who makes it very clear that uninvited guests are not welcome. I haven't spoken to my parents since the sentencing. I'm not sure I ever will again. Isaac and I occasionally text, mostly about practical matters. We'll probably never be close, but we are civil. There's simply too much history, too much damage for anything more. I used to believe that family meant unconditional support, that no matter what, your parents would always have your back. Mine never did. They didn't see me as their son. They saw me as an asset, a resource to exploit. And when I refused to be used, they tried to destroy me. I don't regret turning them in, not even for a moment, because the truth is they never truly acted like parents in any meaningful sense. So that's how it ended. Not exactly the kind of story with a warm, happy resolution. But in the end, I still have my home, and I still have my freedom. And at this point in my life, that matters far more than anything they could ever represent.